In this video, we're going to cover the process of allowing data to come into our controller actions. To start, we're going to do new project. Under Visual C#, choose Web, ASP.NET Web Application, and this will be our Week 3 project. We'll choose an empty project with MVC references and hit OK. So we'll go ahead and right click on controllers. We'll do add and choose controller. We'll do an empty controller and hit add. And this will be our home controller. So our home controller comes with a default index action. And you'll notice up here in the comments that it says get home. Your actions can handle different types of HTTP what are called verbs, and in most cases you're dealing with two types of verbs or actions. You're dealing with get actions and you're dealing with post actions. Now again, when I say actions, I'm actually referring to what are referred to as HTTP verbs. Those are different than controller actions, which are your methods. So your controller actions can handle all HTTP verb requests, or they can actually be mapped to a specific verb request. And that gets into play when we start dealing with forms and the ability to post forms and posting data. But for this video lecture, we're just going to focus on get. So when we type in a website address into our browser, that is referred to as a get. We're going to get the web page from that URL. So this action is implicitly configured to handle a GET request. If we want to make it explicit, we can do that by adding what's called an attribute to this action. And that's using square brackets. And then we'll just put in here HTTP GET. Now let me back that out for a second and do my IntelliSense. And in here you'll also see that we have an HTTP delete, get, head, options, patch, post, put. Those are not even all of the actions, HTTP verbs that you can use, but that is a fair majority of them, and especially the most common. So in this case, we'll be handling an HTTP GET. Now we're going to go ahead and we'll add a view to this. So we'll right click, say add view, and we're just going to do an index view empty without a model. And we'll uncheck the layout because we currently don't have a layout, and hit add. And what that'll do is Visual Studio will go into that views folder under that home folder for our home controller and create our index.cshtml document for us automatically. So this is now our view, and it's just basically a blank page. And what I'm going to go ahead and do here is say hello world. We'll put an H1 tag around that, and F6 to build, and then F5 to run, and that will build. And here's our hello world view. Now this is great, but the thing that we often run into is, or at this point all that we've seen is the fact that all of these views are static. There's no dynamic content. There's nothing that makes this any different than an HTML document. So how do we actually get content from our controller, and which is our C# code, which would essentially allow us to go in and make database connections and pull data from a database or do some other sort of processing or calculations? How do we go about doing that and make it so that that data makes it all the way to our view? We do that by creating what are called view models, and we actually will pass a view model into our view. And that's done from our controller action. So if we go back to our controller action, you'll want to stop debugging, and we're going to look at this view method again in a little more detail. If you backspace and then type in your parenthesis again, your IntelliSense will pop up, and you'll see here that there are 8 overrides or overloads for this method. So the default is to pass no parameters, which is what we've been doing for the last week's lecture and this first part of this week. And then you'll look and see that there's also an option where there's an iView parameter that can be passed. The next one is an object variable called model, and this is the model that is used to render the view, and that's the one that we'll focus on. But there's also view names if you want to direct to a specific view instead of just pointing it to the index view by default, which is the name of this action. You can redirect to a different view. We can then have combinations of iView and the object model, the view name and the object model. We have view names and master names, and then again it just kind of adds to it. So view names, master names, object model, and then we're back to the beginning. So what we can do here is if we want to actually pass a value into our view, we would do it right here. So let's just pass something static, and I'm just going to pass my name, Kevin. So that is essentially going to be our object model. Now, since there is a strongly typed instance here of view name being a string, what will happen is that it'll actually execute this method instead of executing the method of object model. So to fix that, we're going to cast this string as an object. So this string will now be passed as an object, not as a string. Then if we flip back over to our view, we have the ability now to inject that model into this view. Now I'm going to say hello world, or I'll say hello, comma, and then Kevin. To actually add C# markup into our view, we have to kind of do an identifier within the page, and that identifier is the @ symbol. So with an @ symbol, we're saying that the next section of code, or the next block of text, is code. Now, by putting that @ symbol here, we can do things like control spacebar, which will bring up our IntelliSense, and we can now see all of the C# that we would normally see within one of our CS files. Now, your views actually, during the build and run process, are actually just inherited classes that then parse this markup into a C# document, which is then does a series of what are called token translations and conversions, and basically it's doing find and replaces for all of this C# by executing that block of C# and then reinserting it into the HTML document. So in this case, what we're looking for is you can say this, referring to the class that is inherited for this view, dot, and then we can see all of the methods and properties that are available to us off of this view class. And the one that we're looking for is our model. So there's our model, and in this case it's considered a dynamic, and we'll get into how you make strongly typed models in a later section. So we'll go ahead and say model, and then we'll say dot, and because this is dynamic, there is no IntelliSense available to us. Now if you also recall, the model that we passed in was simply a string. So at this point, all I'm going to do is just output that string onto the page. So I'll save, we'll rebuild, and you'll see now that it says hello Kevin. Kevin is coming from the view, or I'm sorry, rather it's coming from the controller, and it's where we cast Kevin as an object. So that gets then passed into the view gets rendered, and upon render, this model, which is Kevin, gets loaded. And we get the output here. So I hope that helps you to begin to understand how data can then be transferred from the controller into the view, and then we can actually render that output onto our view web page that's then sent to our user.